She has previously held a Fulbright as well as pre-doctoral fellowship with the Spanish National Research Council in Madrid, and she completed her MA here at Southern Methodist University, and subsequently she served as the assistant curator here at the Meadows for 3 years. Was that 2007 to 2010? I think that's
left in 09.
Oh, 09, so 2006 to 2009. In that time, she curated numerous exhibitions, including Fernando Gallego and his workshop, the altarpiece from Ciudad Rodrigo, of which she was also the primary editor for that exhibition's catalog. She, of course, worked also at that time on the Diego Rivera Cubist Portraits exhibition, in which he did a lot of work for that catalog as well. She served as co-curator for the recent exhibition we held here at the Meadows of Zurbarán, Jacob and his 12 Sons, paintings from Auckland Castle, and she served as a coordinating curator for our for the last year's exhibition, Memory, Mind, Matter, the sculpture of Eduardo Chillida. She researched the recent acquisition, The Adoration of the Magi by the Master of Siena, which will figure into this series and was part of the impetus for this particular program. And most recently, she curated our current exhibition, Fortuny, Friends and Followers. And as I mentioned earlier, she will today be doing an introduction to this series, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Amanda Dotseth.
Thank you all for coming. As you noticed in my introduction, I've been working on a lot of different things that have nothing to do with the Middle Ages, but today I'm delighted to be able to speak to you about something closer to my heart, perhaps. And on that note, I will just say, if I can keep it together, that of course I'm filling very large shoes here, thinking of this lecture series named for Luis Martín, who listened to me so many times over the years when I was trying to work through some of the issues in my own research on medieval Spain. On that note, this just a brief disclaimer. This is an introduction really to the lecture series with the idea of giving you some background and introducing a few themes that I hope you will keep in mind as you continue this journey that we'll take you on for the next few weeks. So I say The Art of Medieval Spain, an introduction in 45 minutes or less. It is of course, a very brief introduction and one that is carefully curated to hopefully pique your interest for the lectures to come. It's also a less formal, I would say, introduction in that some of the other lectures you'll hear will probably be a little bit more formal, but I wanted to give you some background so that you feel like you're on firm footing by the time we get to our other lecturers. So some of the themes that I want you to keep in mind as we move forward, and I hope these are the themes that Scott and I discussed as well as we developed the lecture series, and ones that I hope you will have in mind when you hear from our other speakers, whether they're speaking about Islamic art, Jewish manuscripts, or Renaissance sculpture. They are, as you can see on the screen, conflict, convivencia, and everything in between. Convivencia is this, of course, problematic term that comes up again and again and is only perhaps partially accurate. I think we'll hear more about that anon. Antiquity as authority. We'll see this particularly today. I think this idea of looking to the past to instill authority in the present. There's a sense of nostalgia there, and I hope this sounds familiar in light of current events. And reuse and recycle. This is my favorite. We could even say upcycle. That's kind of the current popular term, right? But we'll see these objects, whether objects themselves, actual objects, or sometimes styles, motifs, that get reused and recycled over time. Of course, this relates perfectly to antiquity as authority of antiquity. There we go, I'm getting there. So I'll start with Visigothic Spain. Forgive me, please, for skipping the Romans, but there is only so much we can do in 45 minutes. And so Visigothic Spain, here is a map. This gives you an idea of what the Iberian Peninsula looked like after the fall of the Roman Empire around the 5th century. These are Germanic tribes that come into Spain. They fill this power vacuum, and they fight with each other to some extent, but as we'll see throughout the course of this lecture series, there is a desire to consolidate power, and the Visigoths were, of course, trying to do that. They see themselves not as usurpers, but as the legacy of Rome, and to some extent the Eastern Roman Empire in Byzantium, and I think we'll see that in their art. Their capital is in Toledo. Here we go. Toledo. We'll see more of Toledo throughout this lecture series as this core place in the history of Iberia. One of the most important things that happened during the Visigothic rule was they adopted the Catholic faith. Visigoths were actually Arian. It's another kind of branch of Christianity. But in 587, King Recared decided to adopt the Catholic faith. If I can think of one single act that would have a bigger impact on the history of Iberia, that's got to be one of them, right? So much of the art of Iberia after that is shaped by the relationship to the Catholic Church. What you see on the screen are some of the most common objects, art objects that are associated with Visigothic Spain. Because they didn't have such a consolidated point of power, although there were cities, of course, Toledo and Seville, much of their art was portable, and in this case wearable. So we have a wonderful belt buckle on the left and two little fibulae which would have been used to pin a cloak. However, not all their art was portable, and there are some select pieces, surviving buildings in architecture. In this case, on the screen you have San Pedro de la Nave, which is in the province of Zamora in the north, sort of north-central west part of Spain. And I just want to point out a couple of characteristics of the architecture that we'll see again and again. One is this horseshoe-shaped arch. This is, of course, before what we so associate the horseshoe-shaped arch with in Islamic architecture. This is before that. And then these wonderful historiated capitals. I don't know if anyone has had the chance to get to San Pedro de la Nave. It's not easy to get to. It's in the middle of nowhere. But it does have these wonderful historiated capitals. On the left, we have the sacrifice of Isaac. Here we see Isaac is being laid on the altar here, and God's hand is stopping Abraham from slaying his son. And then inscriptions across the top that describe the events happening below. On the right, we have Daniel in the lion's den, which I just love these little lions looking at Daniel's feet. And again, an inscription at the top. So I'm just pointing out that these are incredibly sophisticated in their use of the composition, in their use of space. They're symbolic, but they're also telling a story, telling a narrative, and quite literally telling it in the inscription on the top. I just wanted to point out these two wonderful examples of portable objects that relate so beautifully with the image of Daniel in the lion's den from San Pedro de la Nave. This is a Merovingian belt buckle, so probably France around the same time. I should say San Pedro de la Nave is from the 7th century. And then this is a Spanish example, same subject. So I'm trying to impress upon the fact that images are everywhere. Just because the Visigoths are kind of lesser known than later periods doesn't mean they didn't make their art and have their art. And also that these images were very recognizable. I could probably show you a few more belt buckles like this and you'd know instantly it's Daniel in the lion's den. Another wonderful building, this is the very first paper I ever wrote as an undergraduate, was on this building. The 7th century church of San Juan de Baños, which is in Palencia. And again, I wanted to just point out you have this wonderful horseshoe-shaped arch, And then also, you can't see it very well here, but there's a little thing here hanging just above the altar, a detail of which you see here. This object is a votive crown. It's from the treasure of Guarrathar, which, and it's called the Recesvinto crown because it actually has his name, Recesvinto, on the bottom. The detail here is Rex, so we have King Recesvinto who offers this crown. And this treasure is fascinating. It was actually found in the 19th century near Toledo. And it was a whole kind of hoard of these wonderful golden objects. You can see it set with sapphires and pearls. These are extremely luxurious, presumably following a Byzantine example. But as we saw in the previous image, these crowns, and this is a replica, were meant to hang over the altar. So here we have the king's name, Recesvinto Rex, over the altar. A very powerful statement of the relationship, perhaps, between church and state in the 7th century. And then this I just brought, the Guarrathar treasure found in the 19th century. And again, this is something that I especially emphasize in my talks about what the modern history of these objects have been and why it mediates what we know. On the left, you have a detail of the cross, or of the votive crown, and there's a little letter missing here, and here it is, it's the R. The treasure was actually discovered by a French archaeologist who took it back with him to Spain. Later, negotiations resulted in the treasure coming back to the Museo Arqueológico in Madrid, which is where the votive crown is now. But our little R remains at the Musée Cluny in Paris. It's sad too because it's a really important letter for Recesvinto, right? Anyway. So I'll just say a few words about the legacy of the Visigoths, and one of them in particular is our good friend San Isidoro, who will come up again and again over the course of this lecture. He was the Archbishop of Seville in the 7th century, and he's best known, as most of you probably know, for writing his etymologies, which was meant to be a compendium of all known knowledge at that time, right? So he is credited with writing the first encyclopedia, and he's also, conveniently enough, the patron saint of historians, the patron saint of potentially the internet. I don't think he's official yet, but you know, we can thank him for Wikipedia, let's say. And then on the left, a much later manuscript, which I put up to show, this is a bestiary from north central England, just to show the extent to which San Isidoro had an impact. Here we are centuries later, centuries after his death in 636, and his words, his etymologies, are being copied in manuscripts in the north of England into the 13th century. And one of his stories, the parts of the etymologies that would have such an impact, was his stories of animals and what was known about animals at the time. So I'm just showing you this wonderful little image of a hedgehog, which were thought to feed their young by using their little spines to prick grapes off of the vine, and then he looks like a little bit like a, party cocktail, grapes on toothpicks. So. But these are stories that stuck in the zeitgeist, in the times, and were copied over and over in manuscripts and reimagined by later scholars. So this is one of the sort of legacies of that Catholic Visigothic time in Spain. And this I just brought just because we're on the subject of legacy. I just showed you a 13th century manuscript of a text written by a 7th century saint, and here we have this absolutely hilarious, 19th century painting of by Antonio Muñoz de Grain, which supposedly depicts Ricaurez. Again, he's the guy who decided his kingdom would be Catholic instead of Arian. This is his dramatic conversion to Catholicism. So these are ideas, this legacy of Visigothic Spain, this transformation to the Catholic Church, these wonderful saints San Isidoro. We also have San Ildefonsus, which I'm not talking about today, but those of you who know the collection know our Juan de Borgoña features him. So there is this wonderful legacy of Visigothic Spain that would have such an important impact on the kingdoms to come. The self-appointed, let's say, legacy of that Visigothic kingdom is the kingdom of Asturias. And here we are in the extreme kind of north-central coast of Spain. And here Gijón on the coast. And then, here we go, Oviedo. And then you'll see, and in the interest of time, I'm very sorry, I didn't bring you images of all of these little churches, but you can see this is sort of the kingdom that saw itself as a legacy of this Catholic Visigothic empire. And they do this, of course, in the face of what happens in 711. There's a sort of theme here that I remember being pointed out in all of my classes on medieval Spain of this idea that the Visigoths, they're fighting amongst themselves and they need some help. So who do they call upon? They call upon the population in North Africa to come help out. Well, they came and they stayed. So here we are, as you can see the map here, the border can't see that very well, but the stripy bit is Muslim, and the Christian bit is this kingdom of Asturias that I showed you above. So it's not, of course, immediately in 711, but the caliphate is eventually established with its capital in Cordoba. And we'll hear more about this, of course, later. The caliphate is under the family of the Umayyads, which were in Damascus. They were caliphs in Damascus, but eventually with Abd al-Rahman I, he became emir of Cordoba in 756, so here we are now in the mid-8th century. And then I just brought this because I couldn't help myself. You know, I've just showed you centuries and centuries of Islamic rule in Spain, and I'll show you their art here in a minute, but I was reminded as I put this PowerPoint together of the life of Brian, and what did the Romans ever do for us? And I thought, well, what did the Umayyads ever do for us? And actually that list, those of you who are familiar with the life of Brian, that list they go through is not that dissimilar to what the Umayyads did for Spain. Things like better irrigation, agriculture, there's a population boom, revived pan-Mediterranean economies, for example. We'll hear more about this in subsequent lectures. And there's a strong consolidation of power, particularly in Cordoba, but also in these ancient cities that had been occupied by the Visigoths, Toledo, Seville, for example, and a stronger kind of central government. So the Umayyads did for Iberia what the Visigoths couldn't quite manage to do, which is kind of bring it all together, save, of course, for that pesky kingdom up north. More on that soon. Another point is, and this comes up, of course, a lot, that pesky word convivencia that we mentioned earlier, and part of it stems from this idea that for the Umayyads, people of the book, this means people of the Hebrew Bible, let's say, the Abrahamic faiths, were somehow linked. In Islam, the prior revelations of Jews and Christians were respected, and to some extent that meant the people who followed those faiths were as well. I say this to point out that they're tolerant, but that doesn't mean equal. So positions of power were not necessarily occupied by Christians or by Jews. They're on the peripheries to some extent of power. There were also laws in place that dictated, for example, that dictated the ways Jews and Christians could worship, particularly Christians, things like heights of bell towers, the restrictions on sound, and of course we'll hear more about this in a subsequent lecture as well. So I want to point out that tolerance, then as now, doesn't always mean equality, right? Jews, on the other hand, often occupied very important positions in the Islamic court. They were often tax collectors, diplomats, and the like. And the society that bloomed in this environment was a deeply intellectual one. And of course, although I will not be talking to you because I'm an art historian, so I will be talking to you about visual images, but there are wonderful examples of poetry and other types of arts. But of course, what did the Umayyads do for us? They built things. They built things, and they made things. So we'll look at some of these wonderful objects. On the screen is, of course, the Great Mosque of Cordoba, which I hope all of you, any of you, have had a chance to see in person. Two-dimensional images do not do it justice, of course. Get thee to Cordoba. It is absolutely amazing. It was begun in the late 8th century, in 784, by the Emir of Cordoba that I mentioned earlier, Abd al-Rahman I, and it was, of course, built on top of a Visigothic church. So we get these wonderful layers, and this will continue as we go on. Says something, that, doesn't it? Little itty bitty Visigothic church, and in comes this wonderful Great Mosque of Cordoba. It includes reused Roman columns. Many of these columns are, so this is again our reuse and recycle. The area would have had Roman villas. The Visigothic church may have also reused these Roman columns. I mean, you've got this beautiful piece of marble, why not? And they also reused most so-called, Visigothic, Most Arabic is a different thing we'll get to in a minute. They also reused Visigothic column capitals. So we get this sense of not just reusing, a column because it's a good piece of marble, it could be retrofitted, the height could be changed, but also actual sculpted bits get reused as well. The mosque was, so I should say, here is the mihrab, just to give you a sense of the various different bits that are at the Great Mosque of Cordoba. It was enlarged by Abd al-Rahman II in the first half of the 9th century, and then again al-Hakam II in the mid-10th century. So I've given you here two centuries at least, 3 centuries, I guess, nearly, of different campaigns, different building campaigns. So there's a sense of continuity and of different rulers making a mark on the structure that became so symbolic of the caliphate. I'll leave this up for a minute. Continuing that and jumping ahead a bit, I should say the Great Mosque of Cordoba is now the Cathedral of Cordoba. It was consecrated as a church in 1236 and left alone. This is to say, this wonderful building with this mihrab and all of these wonderful Arabic inscriptions was actually a church from the 13th century. And it wasn't until the 16th that physical change came to commemorate what had happened via ritual change before in the form of consecration. So in the 16th century, we get this bizarre, forgive me, bizarre, late Gothic addition drop down right into the middle of the mosque. In other places, of course, those of you familiar with Seville and Toledo, the mosque is completely obliterated. In Seville, they leave, of course, the Giralda, the bell tower. Everything else is obliterated and a cathedral built on top. But in this case, I think as a testament to the beauty of the place, we managed to get away with this little awkward addition right in the center. To sacred space, we can also talk about secular space. This is Madinat al-Sahra, which means the shining city. It was a palace city built by Abd al-Rahman III, and the first Umayyad caliph of Cordoba in the 10th century. I say palace city because it's a little bit of both. It was a royal palace, it was a place people gathered, where poetry was read, where people lived, but it also, economically speaking, was very much like a city. The site, as you can see in this image, is now in ruins, thanks to a mix of age and deliberate destruction. What did I put this up for? Oh, I know why. So I could show you where Meadows was. Here it is. So you can see it's very close to Cordoba, and if you visit today, you can see both at the same time. This is the wonderful reception room at Meadows, and if you take a look at these wonderfully carved column capitals, I hope you all recognize this wonderful example in our collection. I mentioned that the site was now in ruins owing to age, but also deliberate destruction. And we'll get to the historical circumstances for this, but suffice this to say that other factions of Islam that were more conservative were less pleased with the lavish lifestyle that was being lived at Medinat al-Zahra. And the site turned into a kind of quarry. So again, we have this idea of bits being reused. This is precisely how this capital got from here to here. And we'll see reused capitals in buildings all over Spain as well. Of course, this isn't just a story of architecture. Islamic Spain produced any number of wonderful objects. I'm showing you a selection of metal caskets, some produced within Al-Andalus and some outside. These all, by the way, are preserved because they became reliquaries. They're all from Christian treasuries now, but of Islamic manufacture. Luckily, we know about their manufacture in many cases due to inscriptions, and so I just brought a detail here for you to see the casket of Sakada ibn Yusuf, which is from the 11th century, but of course repurposed, possibly as early as the 11th century, as a Christian reliquary in San Isidoro de Leon. And so I just brought you a wonderful detail of this inscription, and then a photo we took with a little microscope camera so you can see the exquisite craftsmanship of this Niello design. And I put these two images together as well because, so we have architecture and we have metalwork, but we also have ivory. There were ivory workshops at Medinat al-Zahra, and so we know certain objects were made there. On the right is the famous Pyxis of Zamora, also in the Museo Arqueológico Nacional in Madrid. It's from the 10th century, and I paired it with our capital because I wanted you to see what flourished in this sacred versus secular situation. In this case, these are both secular objects. The Pyxis of Zamora was probably used to store valuable things like solid perfumes, maybe cosmetics. But I wanted to show you a little bit of this wonderful technique of this deep drilling, this very kind of abstracted vegetal motif, these wonderful peacocks. And again, these are objects in many cases, the Pyxis as well, that survived because they eventually ended up in Christian treasuries. These objects were valued for their luxury material. Ivory was, of course, quite rare, would have had to come from Africa. So we have objects, materials that have traveled a long ways, worked in Iberia, and then repurposed later on. And never mind, I think, we make a big deal about what does it mean to have Islamic objects in a Christian treasury. I don't get the impression, quite frankly, that the people, the Christians who used them, were too terribly bothered. They were luxury objects that were celebrating the relic that was inside. It was a sacred container. And in this particular case, these peacocks, although from a secular Islamic context, when repurposed for Christian use, could have been interpreted in a different way because peacocks were seen as a sort of as related to Christ in his rebirth. So there are lots of different ways of interpreting and reusing these objects. Here's a wonderful detail. I couldn't help myself. I have to admit, this morning I realized I had no ivory in my lecture, and I thought, okay, we need to get on that. But this is just to show you how beautifully carved these objects were. And here we come again to the idea of antiquity as authority and also legacy. So here we have the wonderful Great Mosque of Cordoba, again on the left. Again, this was built in various phases over the 8th, 9th, 10th century. On the right, I show you a leaf, the Feast of Beth Lazar from the Morgan Beatus, so a 10th century manuscript. And I hope you'll notice we have these wonderful alternating red and white voussoirs. This is, of course, a wonderful legacy of the Mosque of Cordoba. Now I'm showing you on the left, again, the Mosque of Cordoba, and on the right, the triumphal arch, the transept arch from San Isidoro de Leon, a Christian church we'll come back to later. But I hope you appreciate the wonderful adoption of these polylobed arches. In all of these circumstances, we can talk about triumphalism, we can talk about appropriation, we can call it lots of different things, but the legacy of this building is perhaps unparalleled. And so just as a kind of hilarious anecdote, you like this, right? So here, Scott kindly sent this to me. He took this photo in Amsterdam just recently. Some sort of 20th century, I don't know what, but again, horseshoe-shaped arches, polylobed arches, and those fabulous alternating voussoirs that, quite frankly, now you will never not be able to see. And of course, on the right, every time I pass, I can't help but appreciate the legacy of the Great Mosque of Cordoba, from Amsterdam to Dallas. So meanwhile, while all of these wonderful things are happening in the south of Spain, we have the Christian kingdoms of north. And again, this map shows you that as the centralized power starts to break down in Cordoba, in the south of Spain, around the turn of the 11th century, the kingdoms break up into what are called taifa kingdoms. They're these sort of small kingdoms, and you can see each of these. We have Zaragoza, Catalonia, Valencia, Toledo, all of these different kingdoms. And so again, we have this kind of loss of centralized power that, I hope you're noticing a pattern. Centralized power under Rome, things break down. Visigoths, centralized power under the Umayyads, things break down. And just as this is happening, the Christian kingdoms capitalize and, as you can see, start pressing south. The legacy of the kingdom of Asturias was picked up by the kingdom of Leon. But before we get to that, I just wanted to show you a couple of examples of 10th century art made by Christians in Iberia. And here is an opening from the Morgan Beatus, which was painted by Magius in the 10th century. It's an 8th century commentary on the Apocalypse, but illustrated and reproduced here in the 10th century. So again, we have this rewriting of texts, these reusing of texts, but illustrating them in new and innovative ways. Apart from the wonderful Beatus apocalyptic manuscripts, here is also a Bible from Leon, which I just mentioned. It's from 960. And in fact, I can be, as is so rare in the Middle Ages, even more specific than that. It was made in the monastery of Balernica and is now in San Isidoro in Leon, but it was completed on 19th June 960. Isn't that great? And we know this because of this very image, because in it we have Sanctus and his master Florentius who are toasting each other on completing this amazing manuscript. We're at the end here with Omega. Of course, Alpha is the beginning, Omega is the end. And here we have Florentius over here, and Sanctus, and I hope you can see they're holding their little chalices because they're so glad to be done. But I hope you also notice we have yet again horseshoe arches and wonderful interlace patterns. So This image has been used to talk about the, if not convivencia of people, we certainly have a convivencia of image, right? Of a visual language that is not proprietary to one faith or the other. And this I brought you, hopefully, many of you may have seen some of the other images I've showed you, but perhaps you haven't seen this one. This is one of my favorite objects to come out of this Taifa period at the end of really the turn of the 11th century. This is the seal of the Countess Ermesenda. She ruled in a way in her own right. She was a countess, but she was also a regent. So when her sons were young, she acted as sole ruler. To do that, she had to be able to sign documents. And here is how she did that. This is a carved stone with her name on it in the Latin, and then also in Arabic. So you see, this is how it looks like in reversed, but when pressed, you would get it right way round, as it were. This is now in the Cathedral of Girona. So I just wanted to point out that convivencia, such as it is, takes many forms. Rulers during certain periods in Spanish history, and of course at this point at the turn of the 11th century, had to maneuver in both worlds. And this object tells the story of one of the ways that was done. And now we arrive at Romanesque Spain, which I will not go into in serious depth because, of course, we will hear more about that in my next lecture. But suffice it to say, the border, I hope you've noticed, has moved. And this is partly thanks to what's going on in León. Again, they see themselves as the successors to the Asturian kingdom, which saw itself as the successor to the Visigothic kingdom. There's this idea that Christian Spain continues. This is not a break and a restart, this is a continuation. And this takes bellicose form in what we will talk about in a minute, the so-called reconquest. The conquest, in any case, starts up here in León, and as you see, this border moves further south. And we partly have the kings or emperors, as they were called, in León. And here in particular, at San Isidoro de León, to thank for that. San Isidoro is a very special place. It is a monastery, but also a palace. It also held a Christian treasury and a royal treasury, and of course, a wonderful library as well. So it's this kind of dual purpose. I showed you with the Umayyads, for example, we had a mosque and then we had a palace city. Here it's kind of all together. And from here, the kings of León and queens of León pressed further south. To give you a sense of the diversity of objects that landed in León, which was thought to be the sort of center of what they wanted to be an pan-Iberian empire, I show you some of the objects from this treasury, just León's treasury. We have Islamic textiles. This is a wonderful purple silk. An embroidery, which we still don't know where it came from, quite frankly. Again, these both reused to line Christian reliquaries. This is a wonderful gold and silver reliquary casket for San Isidoro. Remember, Saint Isidore is our wonderful Visigothic saint from Seville. This is the namesake of this church. His relics were brought there in the early 11th century by Fernando and Sancha and placed in either this casket or one like it. This wonderful little object is actually made of red deer antler. It's a Viking manufacture. So I hope you see that León becomes this kind of nexus for a wider world. They're in contact via trade and other trade and pilgrimage, which we'll talk about in a minute. They're part of a network where they can gather these objects from different places. This wonderful object is the chalice of the Infanta Urraca, so a princess, reused Roman sardonic cups, and put into a 11th century armature. So again, we have reusing old objects, possibly because their antiquity was seen to be valuable, and then remade in a way that made it current. And then, of course, ivory. We spoke about that wonderful ivory workshop in Medinat al-Zahra. This ivory, however, was made in Leon. So I think there's also a confluence of techniques and shared learning where if you get the raw materials up to Leon, you get a tusk, let's say, or bits of one in any case, up to Leon, it can be carved there. This is wonderful, this cross of Fernando and Sancha, so these are the same king and queen who brought the relics of San Isidoro to Leon. And then I just show you a detail here of the inscription at the bottom of the cross, Fernandus Rex and Sancha Regina. So they put their name right on this ivory cross, which would have sat on the altar. I hope this reminds you of the votive crown we saw at the beginning of this lecture. There's a sort of theme here of this relationship between church and state power. I should say this cross, again, donated by Fernando and Sancha, was part of a donation in 1063, a sort of that set up with the relics of San Isidoro this place as the center of this expanding Christian empire. And so I show you here the document outlining and listing the objects that are part of this donation. They even mention materials like ivory and silver. So these objects, wherever they're from, whatever their manufacture, is very important to the church. And so here I have Romanesque and, reconquest and pilgrimage, and I really do just mean a teaser because we're wrapping up. So I just want to say a few things to kind of set the stage for what will at least be my next lecture, where I will speak more about the architecture and space of pilgrimage. So I put these two images up as hopefully a segue. Here we have the transept arch again at San Isidoro and the wonderful triumphal arch at the Great Mosque of Cordoba. So just a quick word on the reconquest, if it ever comes up. There we go. So, again, centered in Leon, we have Alfonso VI of Leon Castile, who's pressing south here and conquering cities as he goes. He changes the liturgy. When I spoke about the Visigoths, I should have mentioned, they had a specific liturgy. It was called the Mozarabic Rite. It's also called the Visigothic Rite. It was used in Spain, and exclusively in Spain, until our wonderful Alfonso VI at the Council of Burgos in 1080 changes to the Roman Rite. This signifies a desire to participate more fully in Western Christendom. Spain isn't perhaps so different. It is participant in what's happening in Rome. He also marries, as we see here, women from France. This is also about relationships north of the Pyrenees. And so we have a wonderful example of, instead of looking to the south, they're also looking to the north. And again, with Leon as this sort of nexus. Not surprisingly, with battles happening and cities being taken, in the art and architecture as well, we have examples of what's happening around them. So this idea of art reflecting current events, really. And I'll speak more about that later. And then just as I'm winding down here, because I want to point out that it's not all about Alfonso VI. And I know many of you have heard me speak before about women as makers of art and architecture. And so I wanted to point out, although she gets slightly written out of history, Alfonso VI's daughter Urraca actually ruled as queen in her own right. And so I have an image of her here, and then just to show you what I mean by ruling in her own right, she minted her own coins. And just to show you very quickly, here we have Urraca Re, R-E, that could be Regina or Rex, or my personal favorite, Urraca Rexa. So, female king, right? It's so great. And it's she who we can attribute, going back quickly, this arch to. So she's a patron as well of architecture and art. So briefly on pilgrimage, and this is where I will end because we will pick it up again next time. Pilgrimage, and San Isidoro is on the pilgrimage road, of course. Pilgrimage would also start shaping the landscape in medieval Iberia. So I've showed you the three most important pilgrimages in medieval Christendom were to the Holy Land, of course, to Rome, to see the relics of St. Peter, and then, of course, I hope this is no surprise to you, but the third biggie was Santiago de Compostela, which is way over here in extreme northwestern Spain. This map shows you some of the places on one of the main pilgrimage roads. Of course, pilgrimage just means coming from where you are to where the relics are. So you didn't have to come, of course, through one of these routes, but many did. And you'll see that through this mountain pass at Roncesvalles, the trail joins up along these wonderful places. Here's Leon, that go through the north of Spain. And so these places, these churches and their objects are some of the things I will talk about next time. Of course, all leading up to the main event at San Isidoro. The stone bone and two Diegos. We'll talk about the legend of San Isidoro next time. Oh, eek! Okay, well, I did have a slide to introduce you to all of the next lectures that are coming up, but apparently it doesn't want to load. Well, in any case, with that, I will conclude by saying that we have a wonderful lecture program set up for you all. One, we have two speakers, Abby Stockel and, Ali, yes. I wish that slide would come up. Anyways, we have two speakers speaking to you about, did it work? Oh, there we go, yay! I have no idea what I did to make that happen. In any case, we tried to mix it up so that you could get a little bit of a different sense of the different kinds of art being made at the time and different ways it's used. So you'll see we have very specific case studies in some sense, but that I hope fit into these kind of larger overarching themes that we discussed. And you will notice I didn't show you a single Jewish object today, for which I apologize. Many of the wonderful Sephardic materials actually happen a bit later than the lecture that I spoke about today, but you will hear about it in a much better way from Julie Harris, who will show you some wonderful Jewish manuscripts. And then finally, I will come back to speak to you again about architecture and architecture along the pilgrimage road and the experience of medieval pilgrims. And then finally, we'll conclude with our wonderful Mellon Fellow, who will take us into the so-called Renaissance. So, any questions?